I shall hand over to one of our papers now this evening, a short contribution from Oliver Davis and Neil Sharples at Cardiff. They're going to talk to us about their exciting work at Caerau Hillfort. So thank you.
Thank you, Toby. Hopefully you can all see that.
That's great. Yeah, we can see that.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Toby. I'll try and keep this nice and short. I have to, well, partly because I have to shoot off very soon afterwards. It takes 2 small children to their swimming lessons. Neil is going to hang around though, so he can field your difficult questions that you may have. I'll leave you in his capable hands. So yeah, I thought we'd talk a little bit about our work at Cairo and kind of within, you know, so some of the details of what we've found, but also within its kind of broader research context, but also in its broader community context too, which is in some ways just as, if not more important than some of the work, some of the excavation work that we've done at the site. For those of you who don't know Cairo, I suppose if I was in West Wales, I should be calling it Caerau, but we're in southwestern Cardiff, and the local twang, the local accent there is definitely, they definitely call it Cairo. So that's the pronunciation that I follow. So yes, it's the Cairo itself is positioned just on the fringes of Cardiff, so in the old county of Glamorgan, and Glamorgan itself in southeast Wales, and I suppose you could include Gwent in this, but I'm not really going to talk about Gwent, is very much in Iron Age terms sandwiched between 2 much better, or arguably better known, better understood areas of Wales, that of Dyfed and of the Marches, particularly in terms of hill forts. There's been a lot more work done on hill forts in those 2 regions compared to Glamorgan. It also, Glamorgan kind of, or particularly where Cairo is situated in Glamorgan, is it kind of sits on the fringe or at the boundaries of Cunliffe's sort of various maps of Iron Age zones, settlements, economic, etc. zones of the first millennium BC. And these kind of maps where you've got these sort of lines, I always think that the lines, where the lines are drawn, either means that we know that particular area very, very well indeed, or conversely, we don't know the area at all. And I would argue that Glamorgan falls into that kind of latter category, and that we know very little about, particularly about hill forts in this area. In terms of the landscape of Glamorgan, it can be kind of divided into 2 distinct zones. You've got this sort of the upland zone, which is effectively the foothills of the Brecon Beacons, and then leading into the Brecon Beacons. And then this sort of rather large sort of coastal, mainly low-lying coastal area that takes in most of what is now Cardiff, or the county of Cardiff, the Vale of Glamorgan, Bridgend, and leading off into Swansea Bay and into Gower in the west. Now we have, as we do in the majority of Wales, a very good understanding of where the hill forts all are. You know, there is a tradition, a very strong tradition of survey in Wales, led by organisations like the Royal Commission. So we know where the sites are, and we know quite a lot about their morphology, and the morphology of hill forts in Glamorgan is very varied. There are a few kind of larger hill forts, which I suppose in a British context would be medium-sized, but in a South Walian context, they're reasonably large. And you would definitely fit Cairo into that, amongst a few others. The vast majority of hill forts are small, many of them multivallate, many others incorporating cliffs within their boundaries or other slopes. But we have we've got a pretty good understanding of the location and the morphology of sites. The issues, though, are that we have a very poor understanding of the use and the function of hill forts, and that stems from the fact that there has been relatively, or not relatively, there has been very little excavation that has taken place within the boundaries of hill forts. There might have been quite a lot of excavations, but they have been on a very, very small scale, many antiquarian excavations. The best known site is probably, arguably, Llancarvan, Castle Ditches Llancarvan, which was excavated by Hogg in advance of the Glamorgan inventory. Llancarvan situated on the limestone and produced a very rich assemblage of material, but very, very small areas examined. Resultingly, we have a poor understanding of their use and function, but also, of course, their chronology. There are very, very few radiocarbon dates, only 7 radiocarbon dates from the hill forts in this entire area. So a number of arguments have been put forward about the hill forts, such as Cunliffe, who's argued they're elite residences. In terms of chronology, Savory's argued that they're relative latecomers. But I would argue that this is kind of on pretty flimsy evidence. So where does that leave us then? Well, it leaves us with a range of issues for understanding hill forts in this region. The chronology, as I've already mentioned, is very, very poorly understood, as well as the development of hill forts. Many of them are multivalate. How do they develop over time? Likewise, the function of hill forts. What are they actually used for? How do they relate to other settlements? How do the hill forts on the coastal fringe, for instance, relate to all the work that Martin Bell and others have been doing in the Severn Estuary, for example? On top of that, and leading from that directly, is that resultingly, we have a very poor understanding of the Iron Age social and economic systems associated with hill forts, and their kind of broader, how they fit more broadly within the sort of the southern British evidence. How do they compare with adjacent regions? So in many respects, this kind of research context was in part the genesis of the project at Cairo. There was a desire and a need to do some large-scale works at a hill fort in this region to begin to try and unpick some of these questions. Cairo itself is located as I said, in the southwest Cardiff, within the suburbs of Cairo and Ely, from which it generates its name. Cairo and Ely, to those of you who are familiar, are 2 of the most socially and economically challenged areas in all of Wales. They're home to 25,000 people, but face very, very significant challenges, very high unemployment, very poor education attainment, but also possess some very, very important archaeological sites, not least Caerau Hillfort, you can see in the top right image there. Now, Cairo itself, it wouldn't necessarily be the site that you would choose for a pure research project, but when we came to developing this project, that wasn't actually the only agenda that we were bringing to the table in this situation. Cardiff University itself has a big commitment towards what's known as civic mission, so it's kind of how it can support the health and well-being of its local communities, and share the School of History, Archaeology of Religion at Cardiff University, of which I and Neil are a part, has a deep commitment and expertise in publicly engaged research. So as much as there was a deep research need to investigate an Iron Age hill fort, we're also coming from this other agenda as well, and both of these coalesced to create the project that's come to be known as Caerau Heritage, which encompasses the work that we've done at Cairo. That work has included a whole range of things, from excavations, which I'll go on to talk about in a second, but also a variety of other activity stretching back for over a decade now. It involves a huge number of partners and a huge number of different funders over that kind of decade. And there have been some very, very significant outcomes and some very significant social and economic outcomes, not least the archaeological, which I will talk about in a second. But very large numbers of people actively involved in the investigation or the research, clear evidence of people's changing attitudes to local heritage, people being given opportunities to come through to university, substantial investments in infrastructure and local employment, for instance. So as much as this is a research project, it is also equally very much a social kind of a socially charged kind of archaeological project too. Given this is the research framework, I'm going to talk now about the work that we've done briefly, because I know time's pushing on. So Cairo is very distinctive, very distinctive shape to the hill fort, very distinctive sort of triangular shape. It's the largest and most complex hill fort in this region of Glamorgan. It's been largely ignored by archaeologists up until this point, though, apart from a nice topographic survey for the Glamorgan inventory, which you can see in the bottom left-hand corner. No other work has taken place here. The topographic survey has shown it to be multivalate, so it's got 3 large ramparts on its northern and southern side, a single but very large rampart on its eastern side, and then in the northeastern corner, it's been played around with in various periods. There's a medieval church and a likely medieval ringwork too. It has at least 3 entrances and probably 4. So there's an entrance in this northwest, an entrance to the south, and an interned entrance to the east. And there's also likely an entrance in this northeastern corner, which I'll talk about more in a second. We've managed to complete 5 seasons of work over the last few years and sampled around about 0.15 hectare of the hill fort interior. That doesn't sound particularly large, but if you put it in the context of all the other work that's been done in Glamorgan, it adds up to around 50% of all the other excavations that have taken place on hill forts in this entire region. So, you know, in a regional context, it's very significant. We've undertaken or completed a major geophysical survey of the interior, partly part of it is being completed in resistivity, but the main element in resistivity, in magnetometry, which has shown the interior to be packed full of interesting features, ditches, and other anomalies, plus a lot of noise, clearly generated from the fact that the interior has been ploughed in the past. The northeast angle, the geophysical survey outside of that northeast angle showed that there are ramparts there that have been completely ploughed away. So the multivalation actually continued around this northeastern angle, but not apparently on this southeastern side. But there is a gap here, so that's why I think there may well be another entrance into the site. As well, you know, the more you look, the more features you can kind of start to pick out. But I've picked out there some of the main ones, you know, very large enclosures, some very obvious roundhouses that we can pick out. And over those 5 seasons, we've placed a large number of trenches over a range of those features to try and characterize and date and understand what they actually are. Some of the major findings have actually not been Iron Age at all, but feed into a kind of a broad, some broader considerations about hill forts that we need to think about. In that, you know, they can be very, very complex, and they can be multi-period and represent multiple periods of prehistory as well. At Cairo, perhaps the most significant finding is that the hill is the first kind of augmentation of the hill is in the Neolithic, in the early Neolithic, with the creation of a large and complex causewayed enclosure, one of only a handful now known in southeast Wales, but the only one that's produced large assemblage of material culture, and this has produced a very large assemblage of material culture. The largest assemblage of early Neolithic pottery, for instance, comes from in all of Wales, comes from this site, plus axes, arrowheads, and all the other kind of accoutrements you would associate with such a site. There's also an interesting post-Roman story at Cairo too. The boundaries, we put several cuttings through the boundaries, and the boundaries seem to be refurbished at some point after the post-Roman period and before the 9th century. Most likely, I would argue, in the 5th to 6th century, at which we have identified features within the interior and got radiocarbon dates for. Interestingly, for those interested in the early medieval period, Cairo is situated about 2 miles away from Dinas Powys, and the two sites can be contrasted, not in terms of size, but also in terms of the material residues that have been discovered from those two periods. So it's clearly a multi-period and important site. But we've also made a very significant kind of contribution to the Iron Age, to the understanding of the Iron Age. Many of the trenches have encountered Iron Age materials, and we've got a relatively good understanding now, or relatively good understanding of some of the occupation activity within this site. The boundary sequence appears to be of at least 3 phases, possibly beginning in the late Bronze Age or earliest Iron Age around the 7th to 6th century BC, with multivelation added probably in the Middle Iron Age. Occupation appears to be intensive and long-lived, whilst a few roundhouses were picked out on the geophysical survey. In an area we excavated on the southern side, a very large number of roundhouses were represented, which weren't picked out at all during that survey. We have intensively sampled, floated for deposits from the site, and it's given us an understanding of the kind of the economy and subsistence of the hill fort. We have cereals present, for instance, although they're not in large quantities. And despite it being on a clay acidic soil, we have recovered animal bone too, which gives us a kind of indication that cattle are very important in this hill fort in the Iron Age. Toby touched on material culture, or the lack of material culture. I mean, certainly have a very meager material assemblage dating to the early and Middle Iron Age, and it's not until the 1st century AD when we start to see a kind of an explosion, if you will, of material culture represented in the archaeological record, and very large, well, reasonably large assemblage of late Iron Age ceramics. Interestingly, almost all materials that we have recovered are locally sourced. Very few things have come from, well, potentially come from further than a few miles away from the hill fort. By the late Iron Age, there appears to be a change as well. So by the late Iron Age, the intensity of occupation at the site appears to be to reduce dramatically. Perhaps it's largely abandoned, and a small oval enclosure is set up, perhaps a kind of a single family farmstead. So where does this leave us then? Where does it leave us in terms of a narrative for this part of the world? Well, we can now see that Cairo is probably constructed in the 7th to 6th century BC. It may even start as a promontory fort and be added to over time. It's clearly an intensively occupied site, at least for several centuries, with multivelation added in the 4th or 3rd centuries BC. There's definitely a change in the nature of occupation in the 1st century AD. With an abandonment of the site, and that coinciding with the sort of proliferation of small enclosures in the environs of Cairo. In many ways, this sequence, I guess, shares similarities with the sequence of developed hill forts in Wessex, although there are differences, but it does share some similarities with that region. But there are issues, there are certainly problems, and I just want to finish with these. You know, can we actually be confident of this narrative? You know, is this area that we've excavated within the hill fort large enough for us to be confident? You know, you could argue that it's not. We have very little understanding still of the relationship of Cairo with the other hill forts in the region. How does Cairo compare with the other larger hill forts and with the smaller hill forts? And where is actually all of the other Iron Age settlement? Early Iron Age and largely Middle Iron Age settlement is virtually absent in this region, apparently, from the archaeological record as known. So where are people actually living? I realise I've gone way over time there, so I will stop. Thank you very much.